All right, let's jump right into this explainer. When most of us picture the Indian independence struggle, the first thing that pops in our heads is usually massive nonviolent civil disobedience. But the notes we're looking at today completely challenge that single narrative. They reveal a highly organized, deeply ideological parallel movement, one that was armed, radical, and evolved dramatically over 45 years. Let's unpack the fascinating tale of the revolutionary movement and its two very distinct phases. Since we're mapping out about 45 years of complex history today, here's our quick roadmap. We'll hit the three streams of nationalism: Phase 1's early radical nationalism, how the movement went global, the turning point, and finally, Phase 2's major socialist shift.
All right, Section 1, the three streams of nationalism. Let's set the stage and look at the pre-Gandhian landscape.
So what's really fascinating about this is how our source clearly breaks down the early national movement into three completely distinct streams, and these operated totally separately from the later Gandhian movement. You've got the moderates, the extremists, and the revolutionaries. Now, while the moderates and extremists were basically having different levels of political debate, it was that third group, the revolutionaries, who decided to take things a massive step further.
To be precise, the revolutionaries were the ones who took all that ideological anger from the extremists and, tried to turn it into physical reality. Born out of just deep political frustration, this faction didn't just want polite policy changes. No, they believed in armed protest, total self-sacrifice, and what the source bluntly calls the cult of violence. They were literally trying to violently uproot the British presence.
Which brings us to Section 2, Phase 1, Early Radical Nationalism, a period running from about 1890 up to 1915.
Now, this initial phase was deeply rooted in cultural nationalism. Driven by an intense love for their motherland, these early revolutionaries faced one really big hurdle. They basically lacked large centralized organizations. Because their social base was kind of limited, they couldn't exactly wage a full-scale war. So, their tactics became highly personal. They primarily targeted unpopular British officers who were directly involved in racial abuse. So think of it more like localized, immediate retribution, rather than some highly coordinated military campaign.
But, even without a central command, this radical sentiment spread like wildfire across the whole subcontinent. Up in Maharashtra, Bal Gangadhar Tilak used cultural festivals to inspire radicalism, which directly led to the Chepakar brothers striking out in Pune and setting up secret societies. Meanwhile, over in Bengal, young guys like Khudiram Bose were actually throwing bombs at magistrates. And all the way down south in Madras, similar retaliatory assassinations were happening. Basically, these were intense, localized fires burning simultaneously all across India.
Moving right along to Section 3, the movement goes global. Because, as you'll see, this revolutionary spirit definitely didn't just stay at home. In a pretty incredible twist of historical irony, many revolutionaries set up their safe havens right in the backyard of the empire. Over in London, Shyamji Krishnavarma established India House. This quickly became a hub for Indian youth, including Madan Lal Dhingra, who actually assassinated a British advisor right there in the UK capital. And further afield, in San Francisco, the Ghadar Party was formed with the literal goal of repeating the violent 1857 revolt. They were out there using Western printing presses to spread their revolutionary ideology across the globe.
All right, Section 4, the turning point, spanning from 1914 to 1922. Let's look at how a few major shocks brought this intense first phase to a grinding halt.
According to the notes, this first phase essentially ended because of three specific things. First, Gandhi arrived on the political scene as this huge youth icon. The revolutionaries actually decided to hit pause on the violence just to give Gandhi's mass movement a real chance. Second, the British government passed some incredibly repressive laws, specifically the Defense of India Act in 1915 and the Rowlatt Act in 1919, which completely crushed dissent. And third, there was a completely devastating maritime tragedy that just shattered morale.
That tragedy was the Kamagata incident in 1914. So, a Punjabi immigrant hired a ship, the Kamagata, to travel to Canada, but the Canadian government completely denied them entry. Forced to return to India right as World War I was breaking out, the ship was surrounded by police as soon as it arrived. It was chaos. A stampede broke out, police opened fire, and many revolutionaries either jumped into the water or were killed. Our source explicitly states that this tragic end massively discouraged Indian revolutionaries, which heavily contributed to the pause in their armed struggle.
Which brings us to Section 5, Phase 2, the Socialist Shift, covering 1924 to 1934. See, when Gandhi's massive non-cooperation movement was suddenly suspended, the revolutionary stream surged right back, but this time, entirely transformed. Listen, if you take just one core insight away from this explainer, make it this dramatic ideological evolution. Phase 1 was driven by cultural and religious nationalism and very localized acts of revenge. But then jump to Phase 2, and the ideology shifts completely to socialism and secularism. This is a real game changer, because they weren't just angry youths anymore. They were now building massive, centralized organizations with the goal of constructing a totally new kind of nation, and these secular ideals would go on to heavily influence the democratic foundation of modern India.
So what exactly drove this huge shift? The source points right at the 1917 Russian Revolution. Indian revolutionaries started immersing themselves in radical literature, including a book with the brilliantly blunt title Philosophy of Bomb by Bhagavati Charan Vovra. Their brand new objectives were republicanism, socialism, and secularism. To establish what they called a Federal Republic of United States of India, they officially formed the Hindustan Republican Association, or the HRA, in 1924.
The pace of this second phase was absolutely explosive. Just a year after forming the HRA, they executed the Kakori train action, literally raiding a running train to fund their organization. That act led to 4 key members being hanged. But they were undeterred. By 1928, figures like Singh officially changed the organization's name to the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, cementing that new ideology. Tragically, though, this era reached a brutal climax in 1931, with the executions of Bhagat Singh, Rajguru, and Sukhdev.
Bhagat Singh really embodies the incredibly sophisticated tactics of this era. The violence was no longer just reactionary. It became highly theatrical. For instance, he and Batukeshwar Dutt deliberately threw a bomb into the Central Assembly. But here is the surprising part. They weren't trying to massacre anyone. They intentionally tossed it into an empty space just to make a deafening statement against anti-labor bills. They purposefully got arrested so they could use the court cases as literal megaphones to broadcast their socialist ideals to the entire nation.
Even after those devastating hangings in 1931, the movement adapted. Over in Bengal, Surya established the Indian Republican Association. And what's incredibly notable here, and honestly highly progressive for the era, was the active, militant participation of women. The notes highlight figures like Beena Das and Kalpana Dutt, who stepped directly into the fray of this armed organization, totally changing the face of the rebellion.
This highly organized, secular, and inclusive second phase reached its absolute tactical peak with the Chittagong Armoury raid. Our source explicitly calls this the most successful revolutionary movement. Guided by Surya Sen, teams that included women like Kalpana Dutt executed this massive, beautifully coordinated raid on a British arms depot. I mean, it was a full-scale assault on the infrastructure of the empire, a far cry from those isolated assassinations of Phase 1. Ultimately, Surya Sen was arrested and hanged in 1934, marking the solemn close of this intensely organized era. And that pretty much wraps up our deep dive into these source notes. We've traced a wild 45-year evolution here. What started as spontaneous, culturally driven protests by localized groups transformed into massive, centrally commanded socialist rebellions. And they operated totally parallel to Gandhi's peaceful mass movements, providing this constant, violent pressure on the British Empire. So I want to leave you with this final thought to consider. How did the legacy, the immense sacrifices, and the socialist ideals of this parallel armed struggle ultimately shape the independent India we know today? Thanks for joining me to unpack this explainer.